That's it. Hello, everybody. Hi there. My name is Nik Georgiev, and I'm Audio's UK Ambassador. Today, I'll be interviewing Cameron Craig, which I'm sure you already know who Cameron is, at least from from the little picture that we used to advertise the event. Cameron is actually a very old friend is probably a bit of an exaggeration to say, but it's an old friend of mine. We know each other for a while. I'm myself an engineer and I live in London. Therefore, the funny haircut. I wish that I could have, I could visit my hairdresser. I believe Cameron will say the same thing in a second when you see him on screen. Um, we're still, in partial lockdown, so the hairdressers are not open. But anyway, I'm an engineer myself, and I live in London just as Cameron. And we first met at some of the Music Producers Guild UK's social events, and it's been a while that we've been talking about records. So other than Grace Jones, Bjork, Sia, U.N.K.L.E, Cameron's worked with a huge amount of other artists, and I urge you to to go to his website and have a look at some of the people that he's worked on. But for instance, Amy Winehouse or Susan Vega, Joy Strummer, and Tina Turner, and Christina Aguilera, and many others. You could go through his discography, and it is such a huge list of recordings. So when Antelope asked me to do some of these live streams, essentially, Cameron was one of the first people that I thought of. A, because we know each other and we've already spoken about records. B, because of that huge list in the discography. So perhaps without any further ado, I'll put Cameron on screen. And hi, Cameron. How are you? Nice
Yeah,
to
I'm
see
good.
you. Nice to see you.
Yes.
You're still you finding a way to to cope with the haircut situation, and
Yeah, well, I just gave up on that a long time ago.
so you're in London in your studio. That was somewhere south in South London, I believe.
Yep.
Yeah, nice. So yeah, I mean the idea of what we're doing today. So initially when we spoke with Cameron, we thought maybe we should try to limit the scope of the talk, just so we have more focus. And initially we thought that we're going to talk mostly about working with drummers, drum recording and vocal recording, working with singers. But then we thought, you know what, actually there's going to be probably quite a few questions from the audience, and this is the moment what I want to say. I will be checking the chat on Facebook and YouTube. So if we don't reply to a question right away, don't worry about it. I'll try to make sure that we go through all of these. Um, and yep. So one of the things that that I asked Cameron is to send me a list with some of the albums that he thinks that that these albums have either an interesting vocal recording, a vocal mix, vocal production, maybe all of that, and he's been involved with these specific artists and albums. So my plan for this so far is to to kind of like look at some of these albums, talk about the production there. It doesn't necessarily have to be about vocals, but I guess we can start with that, especially because Cameron's worked with so many excellent singers. And then I'll be following the chat, so if I keep on looking down, that's just me checking my phone. So Cameron, perhaps we can start, well, other than meeting at the MPG events, we spoke a lot about recording real spaces in real acoustics. And obviously this is something that, well, I'm kind of well known for being a maniac about location recording in spaces with some interesting acoustics. And so there's this album, this track specifically by U.N.K.L.E, which you worked on. Maybe you can tell me a little bit more about it. I was very curious to hear that. Well, the track starts with this vocal that you can really hear an actual real space there, and it's an interesting vocal production, I guess. It perhaps will be interesting for our listeners. So that was the track that I have in mind. Is safe in mind. Please get the gun from out my face. And maybe I think that you have a funny story about this one that you can tell us.
Well, no, yeah, that was just an interesting track. I didn't end up recording that vocal, but a good friend of mine, Damien Taylor, did. And obviously, when Josh came in, he walked up these stairs and thought, "Wow, it's an amazing sounding reverb." It was a studio that James had in Hoxton Market, right at the top of the building, so it was a massive stairwell to get up there. And when they did the vocal, they ended up setting up a mic down the bottom of the stairs, and Josh basically sang into, he had a microphone set up for his vocal, and they set up one down the bottom of the stairs. So that album was getting very sort of messy at the end. So they were busy recording while I was in strong room around the corner mixing. So there was a lot of crossover, if you like, from the recording to the mixing. And just when I got that session back, I just heard that reverb. I was like, wow. But it was only one mic. So it was one mic down the bottom of the stairs. So I had to figure out a way of making it wider and making it more expansive. So
that's exactly what my question was going to be, because obviously with one mic you will record that ambience in mono, and particularly with the lead vocal, you probably want that to have a stereo effect.
Yeah, it needed a bit of spatula sort of space around it, and just to be honest, I can't remember how I did it. It was probably one of the widening programs, or I might have doubled it up and just put it out a little bit on each side. It was a long time ago, and that became the sound. And the good, the interesting thing about that track is that you end up at the end is hearing, I think, somebody's coming in or leaving the building, and you hear them sort of walking down the stairs, and you hear the door close at the end. And that's actually not staged. That actually happened.
Yeah, and you can hear it so clearly, but the thing is, it actually does sound like an effect. It does sound like there's something intentional that you put there in the track because it had its place there.
Yeah, I'm not sure. We might well have placed it in that.
Right, I see.
But it was part of the vocal take at the end. Yeah.
Okay. Do you often? I mean, if you, well, no, that's a tricky question. I was going to ask you if you have a space like this and you're tracking vocals, would you often put a mic like that?
Yeah, not depends on the track. Yeah, it has to have a track that has to have a lot of space to be able to do that, to be able to judge that, and have a singer that's willing to sort of deal with that as well.
I see. Well, it's probably
luckily
more
Josh is
about
very
the drum
professional.
recording. Sorry, could you say that again?
Luckily, Josh is very professional and very like, right, let's get this, and got the vocal down, and the vocal's fantastic, and you're done. It's not like, the only tricky thing about those sorts of situations is having to come back 2 weeks later and drop another line in or things like that, which makes it harder. And we have lots of convolution type options nowadays as well. So.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, in a situation, so actually this has happened to me when I will record something in a specific space, and then the session is over and I need to recreate that sound somehow. So actually, when I record on location, I quite often will bring a loudspeaker with me and take some impulse responses. And actually, if you don't have that, even if you pop a balloon, that could be actually a decent way to to capture the space, at least to have something from it, and you could later on add it to other instruments.
Yeah, I'm not that together.
Yeah, I doubt there's a lot of popping of balloons that happens in in usual recording situations. Like it's quite a funny one. I guess that's probably mostly me.
I did do one recently. We well, actually, I got the reminder on my Facebook thing. It was a year ago now, so it seemed like it was recently. But and that was in a church, sort of next to Buckingham Palace. So I'm thinking I can't go popping balloons or firing guns around there, so without getting arrested.
Yeah, using a gun with blanks, obviously, it's actually a pretty good way to do it. But I understand fully, especially in London. It's I've done this in Bulgaria, but I don't think that in London you get away with it.
No,
you end up probably locked somewhere. Yeah. Okay. I think we jumped a little bit. Maybe we can step a little bit back. And so, generally speaking, how do you approach when you work with a singer? How do you usually approach that? Because I know a lot of people would like. I mean, obviously, if you wanted to, if you had the luxury, you probably would want to check, try a few microphones, maybe different mic pre's, different compressors. I guess that you're tracking with some processing on the way in. At least when we did that session at the strong room, there was a lot of gain reduction going on the vocal. But I guess that you don't really have much time to do any experiments prior a session like that. So maybe if you tell me a little bit about your usual approach, if somebody comes to the studio and they want you to record them, how would you usually approach a vocal session like that?
Well, it really depends. I'm very artist driven, so a lot of that is trying to think ahead or think of what might happen. But at the end of the day, you need to be sort of driven by the artist. So, Grace Jones is a great example where if she's ready to sing, you've got to go with whatever you have, because it's not going to that's not going to make any difference, but you need to be ready because the performance is way more important than what mic you're using. So, on the Hurricane album, it goes from a really, dare to say, horrible mic. I can't even think what it was now, which either the producer was using before I got on board. So that one of the songs, Corporate Kennel, was done on this mic, which got noise and distortion and horribleness about it. Sort of suited the track, so that was okay. And then that sort of moved up to like a Rode NT1 or something like that. I think was his next choice before I made him buy a U87. So you see that I think you see that in the documentary when she's singing in the studio. That's, I say, you need to be ready, because that take, which is in the documentary, is actually of the take that's on the album. That's why Sophie was able to cut between the rough thing in the studio to the actual version in the studio, because it is the vocal that was used.
But wait, so at the time, correct me if I'm wrong, but this was 2007, 8, something like that?
Yeah, something like 7, yeah.
So by then, I mean, she clearly was a very well-known singer. I mean, I'm just a little bit surprised that she had a horrible mic to start the recording with. But then obviously, it's her voice that makes it all so special, and, the whole attitude and the way she performs, the lyrics. My voice is my weapon of choice. That thing is making it. But yet, I'm really surprised actually she didn't have like the most expensive mic you can think of.
Well, it's not so much that. It was like I've tried a long time to get some really kind of good performances out of her with all the proper setup, and it didn't really work. She just needed to be in the right mood, so to speak, and then there was one night where Sophie, the filmmaker, decided to film her at the studio, which was this studio. And so she had the camera on her, basically, and I think managed to get like 4 or 5 great performances out of her that night, in one night. So yeah, she just turned it on. So it was a little bit like, yeah, we'll just go with whatever we got. That was how it worked. So there was another session. The actual song Hurricane was a tracking session with a whole bunch of people, and she was going to sing along. She had a handheld mic. This one right here.
Oh, that one.
and we were tracking. It was Tony Allen on drums and a whole bunch of people, and it was loud. It was sitting in the control room with it blasting out the thing, and she just had the handheld mic and was singing away. Some of it was, it was still being formed, I think, as a song, but all that performance over a couple of takes is used in the song. So performance is king, basically. You got to go there with the performance over the technical.
And you got
It
to
was
be
just,
ready. And you got to be
and then
ready.
it was my job at mixing stage to kind of make them all match up and actually sound good together. That they weren't, the whole gamut from horrible mic to decent mic was in that.
Well, it's interesting what you're saying, because obviously, the work of a producer is not purely technical. It's not even purely musical. It's a mix of that, plus I think a lot of, the ability to work with people and being patient, all of that as well. It's a lot of psychology. So what you're saying there about, her performance, and actually when you think about it, there's probably going to be a good range of people who would panic in the presence of camera, and they won't be able to perform as well. Where actually with her, you're saying it was exactly the opposite.
The opposite, yeah, completely the opposite. So as soon as she knows she has to perform, she can turn it on.
Yeah. And
just different artists, basically different artists do different things. Like everyone's very different in the way they approach singing. So that's why I don't like to get stuck into this is the ultimate way to do vocals, because it doesn't exist. Might be the ultimate way to vocals if you're a singer and that's your way, but as an engineer, I don't think there is such a thing as the ultimate way of doing anything, because every artist is different and every artist should be treated differently, really.
And I completely agree with you on this one, just because I'm aware that perhaps some students might be watching us, or maybe some people who are sort of in the beginning of their career. One thing that I've noticed is that a lot of my best students, they would try to recreate some sort of perfect conditions in the live room when they have a recording like this, where I think what you're saying is a lot, imperfect from technical point of view. So I always I can't remember where I read this. I believe it was Bruce Swedien and Michael Jackson, when actually Michael Jackson was, in order to perform a song, he needed to tap with his feet, with his foot on the floor, sort of stomp on the floor and make this loud noise, almost like clapping with his hands, but instead he was doing it with his foot. And I believe it was Bruce Willis. I may be wrong, but then instead of actually telling him, "Look, man, this is going into the recording. You gotta stop because there's, it's bleeding into the mic." I think again it was Bruce who said, "Oh, let's put a mic on the foot as well. Mic that up."
Yeah. That becomes part of the instrument of his voice.
Yeah, and it's part of the vibe. But maybe can you tell me a little bit more about, because I believe it was her, you said that she didn't like to perform as much with headphones. So that could be a very interesting situation where obviously, I guess you had a loudspeaker in the control room, in the live room where she sang, or?
No, she was in the control room.
Oh, she was in the control room.
Yeah. Like in the documentary, you actually see it where literally she's standing there. Yeah. So.
And do you perhaps do some of these face tricks where you would track the vocal and then you would just record the sound of the speaker into the mic?
Not really, because she's a bit too unpredictable at the best of times. So it's not like you sat there and did a vocal and then go, all right, great, we got the vocal, and now let's record a track to, cancel the spill out. It's not. It just doesn't work that way with her. So. And that record took a long time. It could be coming back 2 years later to drop in a couple of lines because she changed some words, or, that sort of thing. So it's just not going to fly. You need to be able to deal with the spill, basically, and just.
Okay.
And we spent a long time dealing with
it. So it's actually
the
the speaker spill becomes sort of like, well, it's common that people say, oh, I really like the spill when I record drums and there's spill from the guitar and actually gives air to the recording. I guess this is probably one of those where if you could, you would avoid it. But yeah, I see very well. I think that Bjork is one of those who actually hates working on headphones, actually. And at least I've read about this whole thing that where she would, some of her engineers would put a figure of eight mic that the side of it is looking at the speaker so that you don't pick up so much of the spill. I guess in your case it was a cardioid mic pointing at the monitors with the back of it. And that makes sense.
That then restricts their performance. So. That's sort of not really an option for singers like that. So.
Yeah, I see. Yeah, so
but then, in those situations, they were stage mic, so they were kind of pretty good at rejecting the spill. But even so, just got to live with it.
Okay, well, I mean, yeah, I guess that's the way to go. So there is a question actually. Oh, okay. It's a bit of a strange question, but as I said, that I'll follow the the chat. I'll ask you that red piece of vinyl in the background. I mean, it's not the question I was expecting to see, but
That one.
yeah,
That's Ivor's.
Well, don't tell me this
Original
is...
Beast. So that's I don't know if you can see that.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So that was a song from, I think, from the Hunger Games. I don't think it ever came out. I'm not sure.
That's the saddest thing.
That's Ivor's, I think. So
Oh man, when you work with somebody, even on one track, and not to mention an album, you build such a bond, and then once that music's ready and you've done it, it's like, well,
it came out. It came out on part of the soundtrack for. What was it on? God. I can't remember. But I don't think that the vinyl didn't come out. The track came out on the CD.
Okay.
Part of the Hunger Games, The Mockingbird, that was it. It was on the... They usually do an album that is songs inspired by, rather than ones that were on... Or they weren't on the film, but they were just put together as a soundtrack album after the film.
Yeah, I mean, you've done a lot of work on soundtracks. Maybe we can get to this in a second. But there's another question actually in relation to working with her, and I guess this applies to any kind of vocal recording session. Tom Allen on YouTube asks if you usually use a click, or do you sometimes go for the natural tempo of the track? I guess either, but
yeah, that's so varied, artist to artist, really. So. Going back to Grace's record, there were clicks on some of it there weren't. It was very, Sly and Robbie with the rhythm section on that, so they were, world unto their own. So I think some of the tracks were clicked, because I think Sly wanted to do some programming stuff with them. Other tracks, like Well, was just done totally live. And then I think we tempo mapped that one afterwards, sort of thing. So.
Yeah, I was going to ask if you tempo mapped it, just so that the click can follow the track.
Yeah, it's more for arranging and things like that, because Ivor, who produced that record, likes to have it all there and then move blobs around and move all the bits around and see how things work when he takes that and puts that there. And he likes to do that, so it needed to be gridded in some way, but.
Well, I mean, as soon as you have something to give you the beat, I think that the click isn't that important anymore. But I noticed when we recorded Little Thief at the Strong Room that the first thing was to track them all together. Hold on, am I losing my mind? We did track them together, right?
We did, yeah.
Yeah, we did. So we did track them first together, and then after that you overdubbed on top of the actual performance. And in fact, this is something that I see quite often when I work with other people. For instance, we did another session with Adrian Bushby at RAC a few months ago, and he did exactly the same thing. And I personally quite like this approach because it gives you the live feel, but then also it gives you the flexibility of having no spill. So do you maybe do something like that instead?
Yeah, quite often, like a lot of records I make are, I kind of call them construction records, where they're not necessarily fully formed songs ready to go. And so they might be a 15-minute jam with all the components of the song in it, so you do need sort of separation, because you need to be able to go, all right, hang on, that piano part worked really well, but let's put it over the verse rather than the chorus, and just working like that. So you do need a lot of spill. So it generally would choose studios where I can make sure that I can at least booth off things but still have everyone else play live, because that's what makes it happen. So.
And as we're talking about recording of vocals, this is actually, I mean, I didn't plan asking you this question, but it's just something that actually, well, I want to figure out myself. So listening to that Hurricane record, so I listened to all the examples that you sent me, and what really struck me is that how different all these vocal sounds are. But maybe we can get back to this in a bit. What was interesting to me, and there are a lot of albums like this where you will hear a very dry vocal, something that's quite in your face. You know, it's not like that U.N.K.L.E track where there was quite a lot of reverb on it. And you don't really hear the reverb, but you feel some sort of sense of ambience. Do you find it that, well, I know a lot of our viewers will probably be working in small vocal booths that have a lot of foam around the walls, and I actually find that quite counterproductive. The atmosphere isn't really nice in a cubicle like that, and B, I still find that it affects the low end of the vocal somewhat, and because obviously you cannot dampen the reverb in a booth like that. In the low frequencies, that reverb will still be there even if you don't perceive it. Do you find that there is an importance of like where you track a singer, even if the mic is like right next to the mouth of the singer, like super close?
Yeah, I guess so. In some ways, we built a little vocal booth here, but it's never really been used for that. I would like to have the vocalist in a neutral thing, so I would rather actually have them in the control room and deal with speaker spill or fan noise or anything like that. Is actually a lot easier to deal with than sort of negative acoustics, if you like, because control rooms are usually pretty neutral territory.
Well, so, if they're good,
sonically,
they should be. They should be relatively short reverb time, but controlled, not.
But not, they're not going to be
not bad in the top end.
Even over the frequency response, rather than like a booth, which would be dull on the top end. So then you get this build up in the kind of low mids and the bottom ends.
Okay, well, I mean, I guess that sort of confirms my own observations. Oh, I mean, no, I'm not the right person to talk about this because obviously I'm completely, addicted to recording in crazy spaces. So that's I would just put the mic 20 meters away from the singer and say, no, now you should shout into that mic. No, I'm joking.
Most of the singers I'd work with shout at me if I did that.
Yeah, right. They'll be like, what are you doing?
Okay. Actually, that's not totally true. Another good example was I did a track with Jarvis Cocker and Richard Hawley, and he just wanted to whack down a guide vocal, and I just sort of had an idea and went, oh, hang on, and used this kind of really old sort of I don't know, like a 40s mic, I think it is, really, really old. And just sort of said, actually, just give me a second to set this up. And that was quite inspiring. He was singing to that, and it was quite inspiring for him. And what was going to be a rough vocal, just to get flesh out the song, ended up being the vocal that we kept. So
it happens quite often, right? You would think that you're doing a test, but then the take is the one that stays in the album.
Yeah. That's pretty much the whole album was that. We did a bit of work to sort out a good microphone. We bought a couple of options down, we tried them all out, and then and we set up the chain, which was Sony C800. Went into my Valve Universal Audio original things, 1008s or something, I think they were, and then 1176, and we got the vocal up, and she just sang away in a little booth. We didn't actually pay that much attention, and then that was it. Most of those vocals were the ones that ended up on the record. There were a couple, I think, where they used other versions, but most of them were her singing away, because she was in a booth all by herself, so she just put herself in her little world and sang her heart out.
And do you when you track vocals, is it usually with processing? I guess bit of EQ, bit of compression, maybe.
Yeah,
Not
yeah. No,
much.
I do try. No, I try and, well, it depends on the situation, as always, but I try and get as close as to what it should be. At the time. So yeah, EQ, compression, things like that are part of it. So they will go down, but it also needs to be repeatable nowadays, which is a little bit tricky. So I will tend to err on the side of caution. Mm-hmm. If I get the sense that it's going to go on for a while and not be straightforward, I'll end up going for repeatable more than absolute. So.
And it looks like that this is where digital will win the battle in the end. I mean, no. To be fair, well, I mean, for instance, I remember when we did the mix in the strong room, and you had a lot of outboard EQs, and obviously we were meant to use some of the antelope effects just to show them off. And but I think the fact that I saw all of that outboard and you didn't touch it. It's like, okay, all right, I understand why he's doing this, right?
I used to be, well, actually I started off as Mr. Digital and then sort of reinvented myself when I came to England and became Mr. sort of Analog, and was that for a long time. And yeah, I've sort of gone back to the dark side now, and I'm mixing pretty much in the box. I have a master bus chain, and I do have EQs and stuff up the back there, or sort of a rack of Neves and things like that. But I don't, especially on an album project, I'll put an insert on something, and if some things just, an analog EQ is the quickest and easiest way to do it. But then, on the next song, I'll leave that there, and on the next song I'll use the next one along, rather than, or if it's a similar sound, I'll try that EQ. I won't change the EQ. I'll try that insert. If it works, great. If it doesn't, I'll go to the next one, change that, and go to the next one, just to stop on the recalls, really. So,
but you're talking about analog gear,
analog
on the
side things, yeah.
So mostly today it is where you would use analog stuff would be either during tracking and on your mix bus.
Yeah, mostly, yeah, and occasionally inserts, but that's getting far and few between now. So
takes time to recode these, and if they break. And also the funny thing is, because I mean, probably the viewers don't know this, but I'm also involved in plugin development. And actually, one funny thing about analog gear is that you measure it on day one and you see one result. And then you wait 1 hour and the noise floor changes or something else changes. And it's, what's going on here? Particularly with vintage gear, it can be so unstable, I should say. I mean, I guess that's part of the charm of it, but
yeah. Yep. Like I say, but chain is like a smart sort of LAC one, I think it is.
So SSL style, but a bit on steroids, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's pretty much on every mix. Occasionally it's a thermionic kind of Freebird, although I've got to try out the new one, I think. But if I need that sort of velviness, basically, that does the velve thing really, really well. So I'll use that. But that tends to be like project to project. I will end up quite often just getting a settings, and that'll stay for the album. It'll be the style of that album, and it will sort of almost stay that way for the entire project. I'll end up adjusting what goes into it rather than adjust the outputs.
Okay, that makes sense. Well, that would imprint sort of the same character on the whole record.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, Okay, this is unrelated to the whole conversation we had so far, but since you mentioned that, I can't remember that compressor. Does it have a filter for the side chain? Can you filter the low end?
Yes. Yeah, it's got
Do you
two
often
settings.
find yourself filtering the low end?
I do. Yes.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes a lot of sense.
Sorry, I'm just looking at it now to make sure I do. Yeah, I have done.
Well, I mean, I've used the SL bus compressor for years, and I really like it. But one thing that there's always been a little bit of issue for me personally is that it's sort of in a very nice way. It contains the low end. It just sort of squeezes it a little bit and it limits it. But I find it that you lose a little bit too much of the sub there. And actually, if you do the whole thing with the side chaining, filtering the low end out of what goes into side chain, then essentially the compressor opens up and the low end is still there.
Yeah, like it said, like that, it does. The SSL one does a really nice thing of, containing that bottom end, and when that's a good thing, it's fantastic. But quite often you'll find it kind of closes up the whole mix as well. So end up taking it off, and that's used to, I haven't used one for a while now, but used to take it off when it got to that point, because sometimes you just start to push the mix too far, and if you go just that little bit too far, it doesn't really kind of work anymore. So I end up taking it off and readjusting.
Yeah, it's one of those that usually just want to see. Ricky Damien was with me on a live stream a few weeks ago, and then he was saying you wanted to literally just kiss the needle, just literally see it just
Yep.
moving on the gain reduction. Yeah. And I have another question about working with vocals and also listening to Grace's album. As there's a lot of backing vocals there, so there's just so much interesting stuff going on there. There's some funny sounds as well. I don't know, there was this, like, you get a normal vocal and then there's a double that is operatic but it's quite quiet and it's like an echo. There's some very interesting vocal parts there, very creative. I guess that for this album you couldn't do it because probably the more important thing was that you should be ready for it right away, as you were saying. But do you sometimes change the mics intentionally, like what you were saying about that 40s mic? I remember in the strong room you had this carbon mic. I think it was a Turner or something like that.
Yeah.
It has this distorted, crazy sound that it's weird, but actually it's lovely because it has so much character. Do you sometimes intentionally change the recording chain and make it quite different for the lead and the backing vocals, perhaps?
Yeah, I think like on an album like Grace's, that just happens naturally because the backing vocal sessions are obviously a lot more organized than the lead vocal sessions. So that would be the Girls around an 87 kind of thing, and a lot more traditional in that respect. So a lot more controlled.
Okay, so we have another question from Nigel Hardy in regards to what you called construction records. Any tips for picking the best beats and arranging them together?
Work. It's just, it takes, everyone thinks it's going to be an easier way of making records, and it's not really. It just takes a long time. Like there were periods around when all those records were being made that most records were taking years to make. So I think Grace's one took probably 4 years.
4 years.
Uncle was probably a year and a half. I'm trying to think what else happened around that time, but they just take a long time because you got to be sitting there and just trying things out. So every time you get, as I said, when we make those records and have these great keyboard parts or something like that, and then you just move them around and just find out where they worked best. But that just takes time. So it's not, recording it was easy. That was the easiest part of the record. But then, I think we did most of the tracking for that record. We did the first 3 songs we did in the studio we had up in Kilburn. And then the bulk of the record came from probably a week and a half in another studio. just collecting, call it collecting data, where we just sit there and these jams would be 15-minute long, and and the song would sort of emerge out of them. That was a great one. I can't remember what the song was. It was Love You to Life, I think, on that record. Was it? No, Mother's Tears, where it literally was a 10 or 15-minute jam, and then Robbie's like, roll back, and he'd go, all right, I'll start playing. He'd go, no, further, and about 5 minutes into it, he'd go, okay, give me a new track, and then he'd just do a harmony to this new track, and but all of a sudden, this sort of the whole song just emerged out of this 15-minute jam in the middle there. That's because he's a bit of a genius. So he could in his mind, he remembered, about 5 minutes in, it just clicked and the song sort of happened there. And then he went back and put this harmony on, and then all of a sudden the song was pretty much there in its form. There was obviously a lot of other work went on detailing around that, but it is quite it's just time consuming. There's no secret to it. You just got to sit there and try parts out. But luckily, Ivor, who's produced that record, is very obsessive about that. So he would sit there for weeks on end just trying things out. And I'd come in and say, "What do you think about this?" I'd say, "Yeah, it's good." So.
But I mean, how do you? I guess maybe his question, because also it was related to selecting the parts. I guess my guess, knowing you as a person, is that you would take quite seriously the opinion of the musician into account. How does it usually work? Like, let's say there's a decision that has to be taken, and the artist says, "I like performance A," and you think, well, it's rather performance B. I guess usually it will be the artist who decides that. Although, I mean, obviously you as the producer, you should be the one who decides that.
Well, yeah, Ivor was a producer on that record, so it was very much his thing. There was one track where they'd taken one of the bass, one of Robbie's bass tracks, and lined it up and put it spot on in time. It was a really busy sort of bass line, and put it spot on in time, and then Grace was just like, no, it's not dropping right. And I was like, no, it's perfect. It's kind of like they were just arguing endlessly, and I was just trying to figure out what had gone wrong and why they disagreed. And then came, I think probably the next day, sort of came in and had a look at it and went, oh, okay, so we chopped up the bass line. You have to get very good at in making those records is being able to retrace your streps. So I went back and found the unedited version of the bass line and put that in. I thought, well, I'm just not going to tell him, see what happens. and I didn't tell him till like probably a year after the record was released that I did it. But at that point they all just went, yeah, it's fine. Well, yeah, they were a bit like, well, I don't know what we were both kind of going on about yesterday. Yeah, it was just
okay.
never got talked about again. It was kind of like, okay, it was just that subtlety in performance that was a bit of an issue.
Okay, I mean, completely. Well, it's related, but sort of not completely related. So because we're talking about working with U.N.K.L.E and natural reverb, and then Grace's album where you have these very different vocal sounds, how do you usually approach the effects for a vocal, and particularly the reverb? So I have two questions related to this. So A, do you often set up a reverb that then isn't or is shared with other instruments, I guess? Maybe let's start with this one and then ask you the next question.
Because, I'm a bit sort of old-fashioned in that way, so I will sort of always hark back to my early mixes where you'd set up a reverb for your vocals, or you'd have 3 or 4 reverbs, and that was it. So, and you'd just sort of feed each thing into them. So, yeah, in general, I would do that. I still do that. I don't have templates as such, but I do have like a mix start point thing, which has sort of 5 effects and the 5 sends and all the master governs. But and I import that in and then just try things till they work. So.
until it works. But do you share these effects with other instruments? Because
Yeah, quite often like vocals or
mm,
guitars
mm,
would
mm.
share a plate reverb or something like that. I'm
Yeah,
gonna
yeah.
say that.
Put them in the same space, basically. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And I guess for the backing vocals, maybe you will select something sometimes quite different, so that there's a bit of contrast between the two vocals.
Yeah, I think that's one thing I probably quite consciously do is, in the quest for separation is look for um, different environments for each instrument. So within reason, but
Within reason, it's a very interesting question. So, well, on one side, if you share the reverbs with other instruments, obviously you're putting everything into the same space.
mhm.
Uh, there are some records now off the top of my head. There's the only one that comes to my mind is David Bowie's 5 Years. I don't know if you know the track.
Mhm.
It's a really weird track. You've got the drums on one side and the piano is mono on the other side, and then there's this build up and the track becomes ridiculously loud. I love that. But the feeling there is that somehow every instrument is in a space of its own, and there's a really good separation. Yet it feels like every instrument is in a space of its own rather than, I don't know, having this realistic, coherent space in a way. So, I mean, and I still really like the mixes there by all means. It's just, it's a very interesting question, actually.
I was gonna say I'll end up contradicting myself all the time because I'll sort of say I'll need separation, and I'm just thinking back to one of the last mixes I did was actually I put everything in to the same space, literally. So yeah, I'm a mess of contradictions in that, but yeah, it also does depend on the artist and what you're given, especially as a mixer. If you're given something that's very separate and everything's very localized, if you like, then putting them into the same sort of space works. If they've all been recorded in that same sort of space, then you're looking for separation to be able to make each part kind of come out. So it does, yeah. You end up contradicting, but it's kind of like it does really depend on what you're given in that respect. But I don't know when I'm recording. I don't know really. I would I think sort of esoteric questions like that are probably on the last thing on my mind. Usually they're very
I'm
hectic,
sure these
my
are
sessions.
the last questions. Yeah. It's just, my geekiness because I've wondered about this myself, and in observing my own approach in working. So okay, I mean, obviously this talk is about you, but my personal approach here is something that I quite like to do often is I would have the same reverb that I use on one instrument. Maybe let's say it's the lead vocal, and I'll duplicate the send onto another aux, and I will only change either the length of the reverb, perhaps if there's a localization, so if there's like front to back parameter on that reverb,
Mhm.
or one thing that I could do is literally, I quite often do that, is actually for the lead vocal, I will probably increase the pre-delay, but for the backing vocals, not always. This is there's not a rule at all, but sometimes I would actually reduce the pre-delay for the backing vocals, so that pushes the backing vocals a little bit behind the lead. If that makes any sense. I don't know if perhaps
Mhm.
you do some tricks like that, or
Uh,
it's very geeky.
yeah,
Sorry.
maybe not. Yeah, yeah, it's quite geeky. Not necessarily consciously. Like I'm quite instinctive in that respect. So I won't think, oh, I'm going to put pre-delay on that, and that will push them back, and that'll be. But I'm just a little bit like, all right, yeah, they're kind of crowding the lead vocal. I've got to figure out a way of
Yeah, yeah,
getting them
yeah.
away from the lead vocal. That may be EQ, it may be reverb, it may, because like I said, I don't really have any sort of hard and fast, this is what I do to get this, which sort of makes me pretty terrible for these sort of talks if you're looking for tips, because, but it's, yeah. But I just think about spaces again. One thing where that I do think about that is recording strings.
Oh yeah.
So I keep going on. People sort of say, "Oh, how do I get this sort of sound on strings?" And it's kind of like the room is as much important as anything else. So I can say, to me, it's the arrangement in the room. What I do is way down on the list, other than not get in the way of those things. So it's, I could say, well, somebody asked me about getting some sort of, what do I get to get a E60 sort of sound? I said, well, I'd, get an arranger that's kind of used to doing that sort of thing, and then that should, fall into place. What I need to know is what sort of sonically, whether you want it to be sort of, dry, big. All the studios, especially the bigger ones, all have sort of personalities. So it's a matter of picking that. I've got that luxury being freelancer, picking that personality that's going to suit what the arrangement is and what the song is and what the producer wants. So, but that's about the only time I really think about that stuff.
We didn't really speak about this, but now that you brought it up, I think this is a very important question. And I mean, I assume that you do quite a bit of pre-production work. So I guess that you meet with the, obviously, if you know the artist already and all, but even then, you would want to have a vision of the final product. Well, I don't like the word product, but okay, let's say product, because it's music, it's not just product, but. Well, you're a producer, so we do. It's a product that you deliver in the end. But do you like to have at least a rough vision of where you're going with this? I mean, I guess you do quite a bit of talking to the artists and everyone involved in the process. And who are actually these people that usually have a say in something like that?
To me, it's a lot of talking, with the artist and the producer. Something like strings, it's usually the producer rather than the artist, but and not necessarily, what sound are you going for on this? Sometimes, just talking to an artist, you start to figure out what they like and what they don't like, and what, where they're coming from, basically, and then that makes those decisions a lot easier when you know what they don't like or what they do like, and just working sort of that way. So it's just a matter of talking to the producer, the artist, and the producer will be quite often be like, I want it to sound like this and this, and you talk to the artist and they'll be a little bit more esoteric about what they want, which will can lead to a better sort of better end product really at the end, because I can go, all right, I can get you that sound. It's easy. Bosh, here you do it. But that necessarily doesn't really push anything. So, you try and incorporate what the more esoteric version that the artist is coming up with to kind of get some sort of compromise where they're both going to be happy. It comes back to the bass line again, doesn't it? It was such a subtle difference, but they ended up both being happy rather than pleasing one over the other. Yes.
It's probably one of the, I guess this is what makes you a really good producer or an engineer in that case, I think. So going back to the strings, because you mentioned it and we might as well, I want to ask you this question then. What kind of gear, I mean, okay, obviously you would pick the gear that you have available, but if you had the choice of any gear, do you usually go for let's say more colored mics for strings, let's say some kind of Valve Neumann mics or something like that, or do you usually go for something that is quite clean and transparent and accurate and truthful to the recording?
Like I said, that depends on the project, but most of the people I work with are looking for something pretty colored. So it's a Neumann fest usually when I'm doing strings. So I have over the years have modified what I do, because quite often on sessions where I'm recording strings, I'm not necessarily mixing the track, so I'll end up sort of sculpting what I can do to almost limit how they can mess it up when they come to mix it. So to be very brutal. But if I'm recording myself, I'll be a little bit more traditional, and almost because I know that I'm going to be in control and I know what I'm going to use. So just And there are other things there, like just thinking my normal string setup would be choosing the room for the right acoustic for what the result is. A tree, Decca tree, which is M50s, and then I would normally have a pair of 57s for a bit of crunchiness. And they usually go
That's
through.
not SM57, right?
These SM57s, yes.
On strings.
And, yeah.
Nice.
So a pair of those, they usually go through some sort of compression to kind of,
Oh, I see. So it's the vibe
it's,
mics. Yeah.
Yeah, but they have a really nice upper mid-range thing when you put them in that situation. So, the M50s are really nice and sparkly and lush and everything like that. And quite often, if you're doing a little bit more older sort of sounding stuff, bringing the 57s in will sort of help push that mid-range forward, if you like. So
this is super interesting because, a lot of my background as an engineer is recording classical music, and the ideal of the people that I worked with, I'd say 99% of the time, I'm talking classical musicians or contemporary avant-garde musicians, but still I call them classical musicians. Would be, well, the game, like DPA, Schoeps, Neumann, maybe Sennheiser MKH series, into very clean transformerless mic pre, into very clean converters, and that's that, and it's as clean as it gets. And then the fight is actually to record it in a way that it requires as well the least processing possible, really. But then obviously when you do pop music or any other genre that is not classical, then it's really about the vibe and it's really about the color and how it suits the whole recording. And just to make it sure, when you say strings, what sort of size of ensemble do you talking about?
From probably 17 to 20 something, 27 or whatever.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
No, it's just because of the Decca tree. Obviously that's more suited to large ensembles or larger rather than. I wouldn't put it on a string quartet, for example.
No.
Yeah.
It depends on the room as well. The room needs to be a good component of it to be able to, get away with that. So, I was going to say the Decca tree, 57s, a stereo ribbon mic usually as well.
Like an SF24 maybe?
Sometimes if they, I don't have one of those. So if they've got one of those, great, I'll use that. Or a pair of 4038s even.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
And then 67s over the violins, 54s on the violas, and sometimes 47s on the cellos, maybe even 414s sometimes, and then Vel 47s on the basses if they've got them. So.
That makes sense. The 67 is very smooth mic, and one of my fights when recording such instruments is usually if you're recording it from far, they don't usually sound harsh, but when you put the mic quite close to a violin, it's a bit scratchy, and I think the 67 is a very good example where you get that smooth sound that actually helps a lot. Do you sometimes maybe put ribbons as close mics?
I have done, but not generally. No, because I don't. When I first started doing, I was doing the whole DPA and miking up each desk and doing that. And then sometimes you get the mix and the strings sounded really scratchy and horrible. So I stopped doing that. And then I end up using 67s, but sort of almost up at tree height and over sections rather than close miking, basically. So all you can do is sort of just nudge that section if you like. So rather than spot miking things which sound horrible. So I'd never really run into that scratchiness because the mics are never that close. And you do, I suppose, on the cellos they are close, but that's you kind of want some of that bow noise sometimes on cellos to get them to cut through. So
yeah, absolutely. All right, so maybe can you? I mean, I know that you worked also with Bjork, and you recorded a funny instrument for a track,
Yeah, I didn't
which
find out the name of it, did I?
I, my notes are like, okay, what the hell is that instrument that sounds like a harp, but it's not a harp? That's literally what I've written in my notes about that record.
Is it on the website? I can't see.
So we're
Oh yeah,
talking
it
about the
is.
track "Sacrifice" from Biophilia.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So it is on the website. You can see it about halfway down. Just a giant pinwheel thing, wasn't it? So it was built for an outdoor, like an outdoor thing, but I think they realised it was so much metal in it and so much shiny stuff that it'd get stolen pretty quickly if it was outdoors. Because it's solar powered, and yeah, it's kind of an
Oh,
amazing,
it was solar
amazing instrument.
powered. Well, did I hear correctly that? Or
Yeah.
yeah.
So hang on, let me just see if I can.
Oh, you want to share the screen? Yeah, sure.
Yeah, see, it's only tiny though.
Was she there when you recorded that instrument, or?
Yeah, she came down. We recorded. No, it's only tiny. It's like a preview image. Yeah, she came down, and it was originally going to be her singing, this machine, and a the hang drum player. He didn't get there. The session it was in deepest darkest Kent.
Where was that? Sorry.
Down in Kent somewhere.
Oh, okay.
And there was a lot of snow that year, and we couldn't get down there the first session we booked because it was snowed out. That's how much snow was still. And then the second attempt we got there.
I'm sure she's used to snow.
True. So yeah, we went down there. I had to sort of set it up. It was literally in a shed, so I took down a bunch of stuff, a bunch of different microphones, and recorded that. She was on a 58. Yeah, so
58. You mean an SM7, SM58?
Yeah.
But that was just guide vocals. That was not the actual.
Well, no, that was the mic she was using at the time. Like Damien, who did the
I've
U.N.K.L.E.
seen
track,
this so many times.
he was the guy that he got me the gig, but he'd been touring with Bjork for a couple of years at that point, and he said, "Oh, Cameron should be able to do this," and he sort of told me what her vocal setup was for the rest of the record, so we just sort of went with that. But they didn't use it in the end because they decided they needed to speed the track up a little bit, so they sped the instrument up and then redid the vocals.
I read a few stories about recording her, and actually the 57 was mentioned in a few places, and I think that I've seen her actually singing into it, and I'm quite shocked because I don't know. I mean, obviously, yes, it is the rule. It is the artist's number one. Then you've got the space, the instrument, the performance, obviously, which is related to the artist. And then only then our job has any significance, really, once all that is in place. But still, a 57, I don't know. I mean,
58 it was.
There's just so many. Now handheld mics and condenser handheld mics as well.
But there's French guy that I recorded a long time ago back in Melbourne. He sort of came back and he says, I want to do my vocals. I said, I can do a 58. And I was like, yeah, being a little more arrogant and a little less accommodating when I was younger. I was a bit like, oh, can we try the, I think we had a 47. I said, well, can we try the 47? And we put it up and it sounded rubbish, and kind of like, and then we kept trying all the, 4-and-4, and it kind of like, I went through the whole gamut of, sort of what you learn to do. And he kept just going, try my 58. And it just, these vocals sounded so small. And as soon as you put the 58 on, it sounded like it was a 47. So it was just, it just really depends on the voice. And I just had to admit defeat. And I've sort of been a little bit more accommodating ever since.
No, but absolutely. You know, this is actually something, again, a very interesting point, because there are instruments. Let's say that you're recording a string quartet or an orchestra. There are some, I mean, yeah, you just said that you put a pair of 57s there, but it's more for the vibe, for the, you know, to blend it in and add a bit of color to it. But I don't know, there are some instruments where I guess, regardless of the music, if you just pick this set of mics, you know that they will sound all right. But for vocals, it's never like that.
Mm.
It's always so dependent on the actual performance and the sound of the voice and the music and everything. It's a very interesting point, actually. Very interesting.
Yeah. So I don't know. There's no rules, are there? So, especially when it comes to singing. So if you go to the website, under two photos under the crazy Bjork instrument
Crazy.
is a picture of the Decca tree with the 57s and Roya.
Wait, but did you stick the 57s on top of the Decca tree? So they were quite
They
far
they
as well.
usually sit above the conductor's head. Yeah. So
Okay. Which studio was that recorded in?
it's an Abbey Road by the look of
Abbey
that one.
Road. Yeah. Okay.
But I do, yeah, I use that pretty much wherever I go. So
Well, if they have 3 of these M50s, which probably cost more than my house, but
yeah, if you're recording 27 strings, you're most likely in a studio that's going to have a deck
yeah,
of trees.
no, I agree with that. I agree with
That's
that. Well, where do you usually track strings? Was it Air, Abbey Road, British Grove, places like that? I guess. Or?
those three really. Depending on on availability, but just depending on the sound you want, sort of thing. So they're all, Abbey Road's great. It's got a lot of air around it, but it's still quite dry. Abbey Road 2. Abbey Road 1, I find you need a lot of players to sort of excite the room and get that to work to be, an impressive sound. It needs to at least, I think.
And they work as absorbers.
What's that?
The musicians, they work as absorbers. When you fill up the space with an orchestra, actually, it's like a massive bass trap and an absorber.
Yeah. So Abbey Road 1, you need it's very big and very impressive, but you need a lot of players. I'm just thinking, one of the songs on Grace's record is at Abbey Road 1. I think it's "Devil in My Life."
Oh, yeah.
That's a big orchestral thing. Other sessions are in Abbey Road 2 because it's a little bit more contained. Abbey Road 2 is probably my favourite, but I haven't been there for quite a while now. And British Grove a lot. So that's even smaller. So if you're doing a bit more sort of, for want of a better description, a bit more Motown-y, a bit more that sort of drier, sort of in your face string sound rather than a lush kind of film score type thing. British Grove was great for that. And thinking about it, I quite often would use, you're talking about pristine gear, I'd more often than not use the EMI TG at British Grove and try and use it wherever else I can as well. So.
Man, this console, there's something really special about it. So I've worked on quite a few TGs. I worked on the one at State of the Art before they closed down. I think now that's in Paris. Then the one at British Grove, the one at wait, there's a few others that I worked on. There were some others. Where were they? I worked at least on 3 or 4 of these.
Used to be at Olympic. There was 2 kilohertz. I had one for a little while. I think the one that used Olympics now gone back to Abbey Road. But that's
yeah. I mean, in any case, so okay, let's just say these 3. State of the Art, Sleeper Sounds, and British Grove. And there's just so much hype. Like look, I'm in the same business, so I know when you're releasing a plugin, you want to make a lot of hype about the gear that you're emulating. And there's a lot of hype about. I'm not saying that an SSL or an Eve console, they all have their beauty, and I'd love anytime an SSL, to use an SSL or an Eve console or an API, whatever. But there's a lot of hype in, oh, this console is amazing, blah, 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 blah. And then I remember, because I had a session at the State of the Arc, and I think it's a TG MK2 it's there, or MK4. Can't remember which model is it. That was there. It was the one that he's got a signature by one of the guys from the Rolling Stones, who I think it was Keith Richards who scratched his name with a needle on the console. It's just ridiculous. And I remember I just had some free time after the session that I was hired for, and then I just literally just ran a project of mine, like the multi-track. I just ran it through the line inputs to the line outputs. And that was it, right? I didn't do anything else. I didn't put any EQ. I didn't put any compression. I did that on the second run. So I did one run when I just went through the channels. And then I did another run where I went through the EQs and the compressors, and I added some outboard and all of that, just so I had that, because, if you're there, you might as well. And I was shocked. Like, literally, the multi-track that I had, as soon as I just ran it through the bloody console, it's like, what is going on? This is like cheating. Have you ever done something like that with that console?
The very first time I used a TG console, which we'd hired, the one that ended up at 2 kHz, we'd hired it into Milo, when it was Milo at Hoxton Square. And I always used to love old microphones. I've always had them. But, you plug an RCA into an SSL and it's not the same thing. I just remember just plugging all my old mics into this TG and just putting it up and just going, that's how they did it then. it was just so obvious, the difference. But, I love TG. So
it's subtle. It's smooth, yet it has size. It's very interesting. A very interesting console. Maybe you can tell me a little bit about the setup that you use nowadays, because you said recallability is quite important to you. So I guess, you already said use some outboard, but I've been to your studio, so I know that you've got a bunch of outboard there. Just maybe if you can tell me a little bit about your mix setup and recording setup in general.
I was going to say, well, here it doesn't. It sort of is what it is. I'm mainly in the box, like I said before, with just that mix bus kind of chain, and some stuff over there that gets used occasionally. But sort of going back to the TG, I think that was mixing that way. I was like on the Annie Lennox record.
Oh yeah, the nostalgia. Yeah.
Yeah, it was done at Mike's studio. A lot of it's digital. It was kind of emulated piano and all that sort of stuff. It was, it wasn't meant to be a proper record when they started, but ended up being one. And he wanted to get a bit of color onto the whole thing. So we went to to State of the Arc. But he wasn't going to be there either, because he was off rehearsing for his next big tour. So I had to sort of come up with a method which I'd used on some earlier records of pretty much doing what you were sort of saying. So I would mix the record, so I'd have my 24 outputs, I think it is, on that desk. And I would just bring stuff in, do what I have to do, then take those channels out and record those as stems into the same session. So, and then my mix would come off that. So I could do whatever I wanted to do on the desk, whether it be insert EQs or do whatever, adjust the levels, and then have that, those 24 channels still in Pro Tools doing what they do. So when Mike would come back at the end of the day, and I would have mixed maybe 3 tracks, and then he'd want to make changes. So if he goes, the vocal sound's not really happening, or whatever, can we change this? I'd only have to change that one channel on the stem. So I'd only have to recall that one, one channel, put that back into the thing. And that worked really well. Even to the point where after we'd left State of the Arc and I'm back here, I've still only got those stems. So if I have to change something, it was a pretty easy way of going about changing things but keeping the analog flavor.
Yeah, there's enough flexibility in those stems that allow you to achieve the any
Yeah,
changes that they may require. Yeah, yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay. I mean, well, that's that's exactly what I thought that you're doing there. If I have access to that console, I'll be doing it all the time. It's this actually, well, it brings me to another question, but I often get asked by my students, so this is why I'm bringing this question up. Maybe this is not relevant to you, but I'll give it a go. So a lot of people want to buy summing mixers, and my thought here, I've never done a proper scientific test to determine how much of the sound that you get from a summing mixer like that is actually purely the sound of the different channels and how much is the actual summing. Because if you go into something like a TG, like in the case that you're giving an example there, you're not really summing anything. You're just literally coloring the sound by going through the circuits of it.
Hmm.
And it's probably mostly the transformers because it's not a valve desk anyway. So you would get some kind of phase shift that would somehow affect the transients. It will give you a different perception of space, I guess, and softness and texture of the sound. But I guess do you do any analog summing at all when you mix?
I have done in the past. Yeah. I was gonna say actually no, it wasn't that. But I have, yeah, I have done used Thermionic Do There, Fat Bastard, which was great for that thing. I'm not really, that into. I don't think, just summing 24 channels is any reason to have a summing thing.
But
Thing like
if
the
it's a
Fat Bastard
TG,
had
then you would go for it.
yeah, it was a TG. That's a different matter. But but summing is usually quite passive, and all it is the makeup gain is what's adding a little bit of color if it's doing anything. Whereas the way I use the TG is sort of the opposite, where I'm using the color of all the channels. So, it's the transformers, and I think I got a feeling they're like New Vista type resistors in
You
there.
have a feeling that it's what? Sorry.
New Vista based, the TG. It does have that sound of not New Vista, germanium transistors.
Oh yeah.
It does have that sound about it. So
all the compressors there, I think, are based on Zener diodes and transistors. Yeah.
that's
Very
my limited
interesting.
technical knowledge. But,
yeah, sorry, I'm I'm just injecting some geeky.
yes.
Well, it's a special type of semiconductor. Anyway, let's not get into that now.
So yeah, if it's adding something, then great. I just don't think summing itself. Yeah, maybe like not so much now as well. I think maybe in the older Pro Tool systems, it did do something, because especially if you got really big sessions in the older ones, it just felt like they're closing down a little bit. And I think spreading it out over multiple outputs seemed to take some of the pressure off the digital bus in Pro Tools.
Okay, a completely unrelated question, because when I was listening to some of the albums that you worked on, so I listened again to Grace's album, and this is something that I personally struggle a little bit with. I must admit this. So I've got a pair of large speakers. Maybe you can see the one right there behind me. It's a massive, like 12-inch driver. And I always listen to my mixes on, the small speakers, the big speakers, different types of headphones, and I'll hear it on my laptop and all of that. But what I noticed in her album is that there are these synth sounds and bass sounds that are quite subby. They cry for being very low and massive. And one of my struggles has always been, I like that, and I want to push it a lot. I really want to make that a massive sound. But you need to stop somewhere. You really need to limit yourself at one point, because otherwise it becomes out of control. And perhaps maybe not all sound systems will be able to play that well enough. So is there do you have some kind of advice? I mean, other than, I guess you work with a mastering engineer and you exchange back and forth the mixes with some feedback. How do you usually approach that?
Not usually. Well, with that record, the bottom end was quite tricky because it was just sort of straddling two worlds of the kind of trying to adhere to its sort of Jamaican roots, but stay modern in the same respect. So it was quite tricky because there's a lot of massive bottom ends on that. So it was just kind of there was nothing kind of conscious. There was a lot of, like I said, that record took a long time. So there was a lot of assessing every step of the state, every step of the way. So we kind of, we'd make small changes, live with it for a little while, make another small change, live with that for a little while. So, we were playing in the studio at the time. I can't think what it had. Probably had the KRKs and the Dyne Audios and Oratones at the time. And we'd switch between them, play it in the car, just live with it for a week just to see how it was feeling, in all sorts of places. I think Ivor even went to this big hi-fi store near his place and played some of it on their big systems there to sort of see how it would work. So there was, by the time we got to mastering, there was not a lot to, I wouldn't say there was not a lot to do, but there was, it was well thought out by that point.
I don't know. I mean, I've been chatting to, for instance, Mandy Purnell, and she says that a lot of her work is to essentially get the track prior to the mastering session when the mix is not fully finished, or it's close to being finished, but it's not that final mix. And she would then listen to that and give feedback. But, I guess my questions would relate a little bit more about, because I think that some of our listeners would want to, viewers would want to, I don't know, this is my experience at least with events like this. They want to take something out of that and sort of being able to apply that right away in a way. So do you, I mean, this is a tricky question. Do you sometimes high pass your bass synths, bass guitars? Do you use a high pass filter or something like that? And which I guess most people wouldn't go for. But sometimes I have put a high pass filter on a kick drum or a bass guitar, and that would solve a lot of issues. And perhaps do you sometimes use distortion in order to, I guess, make the harmonics more audible, so that then the sub frequencies can be also audible, even though they're not at very high amplitudes?
Yeah, all those things.
Okay.
So especially soft synth stuff. You can not even hear it. You can sort of sometimes see it. What I used to love about the KRKs was if you had something horrible right down low, the speakers just would, you could just see them go, and you just know to filter that out, even if you couldn't hear it. Distortion, yeah, definitely. That's where the Oratones came into their own, was being able to put it on there and just add a little bit of grunt, a little bit of growl to it to sort of make it speak on the Oratones. And if you could hear it on the Oratones, it meant that it was gonna work everywhere.
Yeah, that's the horror of the NS10s. But then they use
NS10s were another one where you can judge your bottom end by looking at the cone rather than actually hearing.
Yeah, if it's literally, if it farts, then it's too much.
Yeah, pretty much, yeah.
Okay, so there is another question here by I think it's again Nigel Hardy, who asks, do you mix record much in surround? Does that change your approach to tracking?
I have been mixing a little bit in surround. I haven't necessarily been tracking. I think all the string sessions I do would be ready for it, but I don't. I haven't been doing it. And mixing for surround is a little bit different. It's a different sort of world, to be honest. It's quite funnily, it's not as subtle, I don't think. So it could be usually, it's for picture, it's for movies anyway. So you're just being less subtle because there's going to be sound effects and there's going to be all this other stuff on there that's going to be competing with your music as well. So
I mean, I personally am very excited about the whole 3D audio that's happening at the moment, virtual reality, all of that stuff. My feeling, in a way, I mean, obviously, as you have so many loudspeakers around you, or maybe you're mixing in binaural, for binaural delivery.
Mm.
But in any case, it feels almost like some things are a lot more, like they're just much easier to achieve there. Yet it's a completely different field. So there's other challenges that are completely unrelated to when you work in stereo. I guess in stereo, you really try to create this illusion that you've got a 3D soundscape, but
Yeah,
you're just listening to two loudspeakers, and that's
like I say,
a big part of the struggle, right?
that's what I mean. The subtlety of like working in stereo, you've got to work quite hard to create the depth and the width and kind of all those things that you're trying to do. Whereas working in 5.1 anyway, which is what I would be working in, that's sort of there already for you. If you want it to sound like it's coming from over there, you just put it over there. It's not. It's a little less, a little less trickery involved. But there are other technical things as well you've got to look out for. But like you said, it's the same but different. So,
do you maybe sometimes start the mix in mono and try to make it work well in mono and then go to stereo?
I
don't
a
do
stereo
it.
mix, yeah, very much so. Yeah, like sorry, I was thinking surround. Then I was like, what? No.
No,
But
it's just
in a stereo mix, yeah, definitely. There's probably a period in the mix where I will be in mono on small speakers, and I'll stay there for probably an hour or two, just making sure that it all works like that as well. I tend to use, unlike a lot of people, I would tend to use two speakers, but in mono. So I'm thinking a lot of.
Oh, right. So it's
see
not one
pictures
speaker,
of control rooms.
it's
You'll
two of
always
them.
see two oratones next to each other.
Okay.
Which I've done. I didn't realize I've been doing it for so long, but I just found some old photos the other day, and they're like that. Some back from when I was about 20. So I don't know where I picked that up from.
It might be a bit historic because, in the old Neve desk, you would have a loudspeaker on one side of the console only that you can actually then, hear that. Might be coming from that, and then it's sort of like a cultural thing, or good knows.
Well, I think we always, I would love baritones, and I think by putting them together, they always used to just couple a little bit as well, so they just give you that little tiny bit more bass.
I see. Yeah.
So and that would just sort of help a little bit, but I think that's probably where it came from. But I've always done it. Just trying to find the picture whether I can see it.
And your current setup, or maybe you can tell me a little bit about the current setup that you use. So it's mainly Pro Tools, I guess, and then
it's Pro Tools. At the moment, I've got a sort of extra monitor because we're doing so much remote stuff. I have an extra monitor which I have Zoom on.
Right, because everything's now online, of course. Yeah.
Well, that just got set up recently. I just finished mixing a Katie Mello record where we had to finish it off remotely, but she wanted to be involved, so she was sitting on that monitor there. And it was just like normal mixing, but she was on the screen rather than sitting next to me.
Mixing, so to speak. Yeah.
And we used audio movers to great effect. So, and I have two monitors. I have the main monitor, and then I have a secondary monitor where I put all the gubbins, like folders and so just all the technical stuff. I usually actually have a row of meters as well because I'm a stickler for levels. So I'll have meters on different stages of the mix. So I'll have it like pre-master, post-master, and then post-limiting, if you like.
So wait, so when you say master, you mean the mix bus processing and then the limiter on your mix bus, which you mix into? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, eventually I will do. Yeah, so on a typical mix, I would set it up to run at 0 VU at minus 18. I think quite conservative.
Yeah.
And mix like I would on an analog console at that level. So I'll have a meter before I go to my mix bus stuff, and then I'll have another meter afterwards, so I can judge what the mix stuff is doing.
And so you try to match them and then listen to.
And then I'll have the limiter on, and then another meter after that, so I know that they're all set at different levels. So the pre will be set to -18, as will the post one, because I don't want to really fool myself into thinking it's getting better when it's just getting louder.
Yeah.
And then the post limiting one will be set to -10 or -12, depending on the project. And the idea of the game is to get those two levels the same. Only one is 8 dB louder than the other. So, yeah.
But then are you, after that, I guess when you send the mixes to the artist and A&R label, whatever other people were involved, you keep the limiter. But then when you send it for mastering, do you take off the limiter?
I send both, yeah. So I send one without the limiter and one with, because generally speaking, they want to know what people have been listening to.
Yeah.
And yeah. So, it's good for them they don't, generally speaking, they wouldn't use it. Sometimes they have, sometimes that limiting becomes, especially if you're hitting it a little bit too hard, that limiter becomes part of the sound.
It does, yeah. And there's just so much distortion that they introduce. They change the sound, all of them, right?
So obviously, I try and avoid that, but sometimes that happens, and you have to kind of go with it. That's why I'll always send both, because I think Mandy was always a stickler for that one. It was like, always send me what you've done, because sometimes it's got a.
Oh, so you work often with Mandy then, and.
Yeah, I've done in the past. Yeah, so.
Yeah.
They have a sonic footprint, if you like, and sometimes you need to either match that or use it, depending on what's whether I've hit it too hard or not.
Okay. Okay. Let me see if there's any questions left. I believe that we answered most of these. But I just looking at the clock, I think that we kind of have to finish soon. I think that I could absolutely have this conversation for another. Is what you said. It will be just another call with Nik on the phone, and we're just going to talk audio, and then the only difference is that that's going to be live streamed.
That's what we need to call it. On the phone with Nik.
Is that what is it called like that in your calendar, or? Well, maybe we can do another one. I personally thought this was really informative. I learned a lot of things myself. I don't know. Maybe just to finish it off, because we did something like this with Ricky, and I think it's an interesting question. Let's say that you recorded the vocal. Everything is already edited, tuned if you have to tune anything. Maybe this is actually also another question: what software do you use for tuning, if you ever have to use tuning, because you work with so many great artists that they probably don't need much tuning. But let's say that you're done with that stage. What would be the first thing that you do when you approach the mix of the vocal specifically? So I'm talking things like high pass filter, gain automation, compression, EQs. But maybe if you can run me through. I mean, I understand that you don't always follow the same recipe, because all of them vocals sound completely different. Yet, what are the usual steps that you would take?
For me, it'd be levels first. So I would go through, and before I EQ'd, before I did anything, would just be get it to sit as nicely as you can, level wise, and then then that will hopefully point out whether there's any EQ that needs doing, and then more compression after that, actually. So try and avoid that. Speaking of Katie's record was a great example where she didn't like the sound of compression. Full stop.
Oh, so, wow. Okay, but you didn't use any compression on that record?
I did use a little bit.
But she doesn't know.
No, she knows. But we so that was very much, I had to go through it and make sure that it was all sort of working, and then I'd do a lot of that with clip gaining and stuff like that. So yeah, because she'd recorded it purely, preamp straight to Pro Tools kind of thing. So then I had to go through and clip gain it all a little bit and sort of get it to sit, and at least the quiet bits were not so quiet and the loud bits were not so loud, using clip gain, because I didn't want it to get to a loud bit and the compressor kick in and she go, oh no, I don't like that, get rid of it. So I needed to avoid that situation, so got it sitting as nicely as I could without any compression, and then snuck in a little bit on it.
And I guess back in the day, did you ever use any manual? I mean, okay, this is. I don't know if you've ever done something like this, but because I've seen some people doing it, and I've tried it, and it's a very challenging thing. If you know the song in advance, that's clearly gonna work. But have you ever done any gain writing while you're recording?
Yeah, all the time. I knew you were gonna ask that.
Yeah.
yeah, literally, yes. That's why I got preamps that are just there, so I'll sit there and be able to kind of ride the gain, constantly doing that. So
oh, nice. Well, so that's good to hear that I'm not the only crazy person who does something like that. But I mean, at the end of the day, right, is the whole point of processing something and working on it during the recording is that you deliver it in the best possible way.
Yeah.
When whoever's mixing that after that is going to figure out. And so how about filtering? I guess do you do that already at the recording stage, right, straight away, or do you
No.
it?
I tend to, sort of let it all hang out until there's a problem. So I wouldn't just automatically stick a filter on it.
But not even like, I don't know, 50 hertz or something like that?
Not as a rule.
Okay.
Like I would if it was all of a sudden you start to hear some noises or extraneous noises and things like that, the filter would then come on. But I don't tend to, I wouldn't want that to kind of color my opinion of what's going on. So I might filter out just as a matter of course, and then add some bottom end into the vocal because it was missing it. To me, that's not really the right way of going about it. I think you should be learning to go, all right, well, this is the bottom end in there. We've got a problem with some rumble or whatever. We'll filter that off rather than just filter it off and then just go, oh, hang on. If you don't know, if you're not hearing it, you don't know that the bottom end's missing, if you know what I mean. So, it's, it gets back to every situation being different. So,
it's great because, in a way, it feels like the things that I tell my students, apart from the filtering, which I have to admit, I usually record with a high-pass filter. But it wouldn't be an aggressive high-pass filter. I would be very careful to not filter out any of the fundamental frequencies of the singer. It's just literally just getting rid of rumble. But the rest of the process, that whole thing about... I at least I remember when I started mixing for the first time, that was one of my biggest struggles. You set up the compressor in one way, it sounds really good in the chorus, and then you go to the verse and it doesn't do anything. It's just because the chorus is much louder. So how about actually, doing your levels first? So absolutely, I'm really happy that all of that coincides perfectly. With what I teach and what other producers are telling me. So
yeah. The clip gain was a bit of a godsend in that respect, I guess.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Well, Cameron, I think, let me just double check in case there's a new question that might have... No, there's nothing new here. Let me just have a look at Facebook. And I think this is it. Yeah. I think that we can call it... Yeah, but I thought that was great. It was very useful. So this talk will be available not only... Well, will be available even after this event. So if you go to, I believe both on Facebook and YouTube, but if not, then definitely on YouTube, it will be there. And perhaps we can do another one at a later stage, because I thought that was really, really, really interesting.
Yes, great. Excellent.
Thank you so much for this, and well, hope to see you soon.
Sure. You will.
Cheers. Bye bye.
Hey.